Hello and welcome to exercise 69, practice rendering a model. So to begin, let's go ahead and make sure that our current renderer in Rhino is set to the Rhino render. So go to your top menu, current renderer, and again we need to make sure to set to Rhino render. The next thing we're going to do is click on the pull-down menu in your viewport title bar and make sure the viewport style is set to render. The viewport mimics but does not exactly duplicate what you will get in a render. So the first thing we're going to do is assign a material to the handle by object. To render the handle in color, we will first assign a red glossy material to the handle object. This material assigned to the object will override any material that might be assigned to the layer of the object. So go ahead and click on the handle itself, and let's go ahead and move over to our Properties panel and click on the Material tab, right? And now here, we're going to click on the pull-down menu, right? And we're going to use a new material. And go ahead and select Custom. And the first thing we're going to do is name it. In this case, we're going to be naming it red_glossy. Right? Now, under the Custom Settings, click in the color bar, and from the color swatches, select red, and then click OK. Next, change the gloss finish setting to somewhere between 80 and 90%. A gloss finish of 0 means that the object is not shiny at all, and it will not have a specular highlight. A low value of gloss finish makes the shiny spot to be small, and the object will look glossier. As the gloss finish increases in value, the shiny spot gets larger. This makes the object look more like it is made out of a reflective material. The shiny spot only appears when you are looking at an object at a certain angle relative to the angle of light. Alright, so let's go ahead and full screen our perspective viewport. The next thing I'm going to do is run a rendering, but I need to make sure that none of the sides of my image are getting cropped out in my rendering, so I'm going to manipulate the safe frame settings. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and show safe frame in the active view, and the only one I need is the live area. Okay, and now you can see this kind of very subtle yellow highlighted frame that lets us know that nothing is getting cropped in this particular rendering. Right? So now I can go ahead and render. A display window will appear with the current viewport rendered in colors, but it's probably going to be lacking in some detail. You can go ahead and close this display window without disturbing your model. Placing lights will add depth and detail to this rendered image. Now, to assign a material to the blade by layer, it's going to require some slightly different steps than assigning by object. To render the blade in color, we will next assign a yellow glossy material to the blade layer. All the objects on the blade layer that do not have an object material override are rendered in the material. That is an advantage of rendering with material set to by layer. Changing the layer's material will result in all the objects on that layer updating. So go ahead and select the blade, and then let's go to our layers panel, right? And for the blade layer under the material tab, go ahead and click right there, right? And you'll see it's currently set to white as a default kind of material. So it appears invisible, but when you click on it, you'll see your layer material dialog box pop up. So here, let's go ahead and change that color to yellow. Okay, and let's also add a little bit of a gloss finish, right? So let's again make sure it's set to custom. And now we can pull the gloss finish to, again, somewhere between 80 and 90%. And then we can go ahead and name this color Yellow Glossy. And then OK. And now you'll see that the blade has changed colors or properties according to the entire layer, right? So once more, go ahead and run a render. Render, render. There you go. And now you see the material changes have been updated, right? And again, you can go ahead and close this box without affecting your model. Now, to add a new material to a layer, you can go ahead and go back to your properties panel, right? And then under the, for instance, the blade layer, you can click once more to open up your layer material dialog box, right? And then up here at the very top, click on your pull down menu and you can add as many new materials as you see fit, right? So let's go ahead and try adding another custom material. And let's go ahead and name this one White Glossy. And change it to white. Okay. And we want a gloss finish, again, somewhere between 80 and 90%. And then you can hit OK. Right? And let's render the model once more. And again, you'll notice that the material properties have been updated. Okay, let's go ahead and close that out. And now let's explore with adding lights, right? To place a light, let's go ahead and begin by zooming out so we can see all four of our viewports, right? Top, front, right, and perspective. And let's go to render and create spotlight. For the base of cone, in your command bar, enter 0, enter. For the radius, with your cursor, pick a point so that the circle is larger than the entire screwdriver in your top viewport, right? Like so. Now, for the end of cone, hold down the control key and pick a point below and to the right in your top viewport. This is going to activate elevator mode, right? Now, for the end of cone, pick a point above the object in your front viewport, like so. Now let's go ahead and go back to our perspective viewport and run a render. Okay, and notice the lighting effects have been updated accordingly. Right now we have a spotlight within our final rendering. Okay, go ahead and close that out. All right, and let's go ahead and place a second light. So once again, working in our top viewport, go ahead and go to render, create spotlight. For the base of cone, enter 0, enter. And then for your radius, pick a point so that the circle is larger than the handle of the screwdriver in your top viewport. And now for the end of cone, hold down the control key on your keyboard and pick a point below and to the left in your top viewport. Once again, we're activating elevator mode. Now, for the end of cone, pick above the object in the front viewport, like so. Let's go back to our perspective viewport and run a render once more. There we go. Now, to assign properties to these lights, right? They are objects that can be manipulated and moved, much like everything else within Rhino. So go ahead and select your lights. Remember you can select one at a time or both of them together to change their properties simultaneously, right? And then you can go over to your properties panel and click on your lights tab, right? And here you can adjust the intensity, right? And color, right? And the type, etc., etc. The type is actually listed for you, and you can name your lights. And let's say we want to manipulate, oops, I'm going to manipulate the intensity here, right? And I want it to be 0.5. There we go. Now let's run a rendering once more. Right, and you'll see that the lighting is now far more subtle, right? I cut it in half, 50% basically, right? Now, to add textures, let's go ahead and add a bumpy surface to the handle of this screwdriver. So go ahead and select the handle. Now in your properties panel, go ahead and click on the material tab and go ahead and scroll down. Under the textures, you'll see bump, right? Go ahead and check that box and then click to assign, and then you can open the auxiliary image that was provided to you called Cell 2 and then open. There we go. Now go ahead and make sure that's set to 100, right? So you can really see how this kind of affects the texture in your model. If you click, it's almost like a hyperlink. If you click on the image itself, you'll open the editing dialog box. Let me make that a little bit larger. And here is where you can manipulate the U and V mapping. In this case, let's go ahead and change the U repeat to 2 and the V repeat to 2 as well, and then click OK. And then render once more to see the final results. And now you'll notice that there is a significant bump texture to your screwdriver model. Now let's add a texture to the handle, right? So go ahead and click on the handle once more. And this time let's uncheck the box that says bump, right? And in the textures area under color this time, go ahead and click to assign, and we're going to assign the sample image that was provided to you called wood, right? And then open. Wood color texture is now mapped onto the handle, right? And remember, you can click on the blue kind of hyperlink here to open up your editing, for the dialog box to manipulate the editing and the mapping for this particular color, or your bumps, etc., under your texture settings. And here we can once again manipulate the U and V repeats for the mapping. In this case, let's go ahead and change the U repeat to 4 and the V repeat to 6. And then click OK. And let's run a render one more time. There we go. And I actually want to make this a little bit brighter, so I'm going to go back and take the intensity of my spotlights to 0.75, like so. All right, there you go. Now, to make the wood handle transparent, So one more time, I'm going to click on the handle itself, and in the Properties panel, I'm going to select the Material tab, and right here, well, let me kind of make that larger so you can see that. You'll see where it says Transparency, right? Go ahead and change that slider to about 30%. There we go, 30%. And one more time, let me minimize this, and let's run a rendering. There we go. All right, so now let's go ahead and practice one more material change. Let's go back to the Materials tab. And let's try the red gloss one more time, only this time let's add some transparency, right? So let's go to red, okay, and a little bit of glossiness, and transparency, and render, render. All right. Now, in closing, I would like to add, if you're familiar with Photoshop and transparent backgrounds, within programs like Photoshop, you're familiar also with PNGs, right? And so there are going to be instances when you're going to run a rendering and you're going to want a transparent background, something that will clearly reflect the transparency that you see here, right? So keep in mind, by default, these renderings are being saved as JPEGs, right? With this kind of default solid background color, right? So if you want a transparent background, right, and then you can save the rendering, say, as a PNG, and save yourself some time with the polygonal lasso tool, for example, within Photoshop, then what you're going to want to do is go to Render, Render Properties, and scroll down, and you're going to want to make sure that this little box is selected, that you see that check mark in there that says transparent background. Okay, all right, and then when you render, right, you'll see that transparent checkerboard background that you are all familiar with within Photoshop. All right, and then from here you can save as, and save it as a PNG, again, to preserve that transparent background, or also the more kind of traditional format JPEG, right? And I'll go ahead and close that out. All right, now last thing we're going to cover here is working with a ground plane. So let's go ahead and go over to our Properties panel, right? And right click. And you'll see where it says ground plane, right? Go ahead and check that little box to activate your ground plane settings, right? And then you can go ahead and turn that on, right? Now your viewport will now show a ground plane, right? So let's go ahead and assign a material to this ground plane. So in the material area, assign the existing yellow glossy, right, that we created earlier in this exercise. And now you'll see the viewport shows a yellow glossy ground plane, right? So now let's run a render, see what that looks like. There we go. And now those spotlights are really obvious, right? Now that we have that ground plane in there. All right, go ahead and close that out. And now let's try something a little bit different. Now let's try and go to the textures instead, all right, and assign the wood as the ground plane, right? Render, render. You can see the itty bitty tiling of the mapping, right? So let's go ahead and manipulate that a little bit more. X 100 and Y 75. Now let's try that again. Render, render. And there you have it. And that concludes exercise 69.